The hallway stretched unwavering straight ahead, flanked on both sides by a forest of ornately engraved pillars. Reliefs and decorations covered the walls, primitive depictions of strange creatures, whimsical forms, and geometrical shapes. Everything was blue, from the indigo and cobalt of the columns to the midnight blue of the vaulted ceiling. She would have been fascinated in different circumstances. She barely glanced at the patterns anymore, because nearly an hour of brisk but cautious walking had brought a different concern to her attention. "I hate these clothes." The raggedy shirt, faded and filthy, was one rip away from falling apart. It clung to all the wrong places and constantly rubbed against sensitive areas. The skirt would shift on its own, flap about and be a general bother. Coarse and full of hard edges, it scraped her thighs with every step. And it felt too loose down there, too airy. She loathed skirts. She would have stripped down to her underwear, but her underwear was gone. Alexandra was well aware that she had much bigger problems to worry about, but her mind kept coming back to her attire no matter how much she tried to focus on everything else. She grabbed at the shirt and curtly adjusted its tattered hem for the 100th time. One of the holes in the fabric ripped a bit further. Ah! These clothes had no reason to exist other than their connection to her newfound foolhardiness. They'd been the only clothes she'd owned back when shoes were a coveted luxury. Does a soul wear clothes? Alexandra tried to shove the question away as soon as it formed, but she found the silliness of it impossible to ignore. She had hardly expected everyone to be naked in heaven, but how could a spirit possibly wear actual clothes? Might as well say that she'd have to shave her legs and trim her fingernails next. Or did the fabric have a soul too, so that it could transcend into the afterlife? It was a remote possibility, except she hadn't died in these clothes. These clothes had shown up out of nowhere. Huh. If they can pop out of thin air like that, could they also? As the possibility blossomed in her thoughts, the skirt she was dejectedly glaring at started rippling, its fabric sublimating into billows of mist. She stopped in mid-stride and stared as it blurred, melted, and scattered before her eyes, leaving only bare skin behind. She was stark naked. No way! Alexandra looked around in a panic, then jumped behind a nearby pillar. She felt silly for it almost immediately, but even then the prim and modest part of her wanted nothing more than to have those nasty clothes back. As soon as she acknowledged the thought, they coalesced back in place. Whoa! There was a certain elegance to how they materialized, fleeting gusts of smoke coming together to become solid. She feared the crippling headache would make a roaring comeback, but all she felt was a small stab in her temples that was gone almost before it began. This is an interesting development. Could she do it again? How much control did she have over it? Best to find out while there was relative calm. She wouldn't want a wardrobe malfunction in the middle of monster bashing. Alexandra did as she had done before, believing that the clothes shouldn't be there at all. With hardly an effort, they dissolved into nothingness. Another thought, and the clothes coalesced on demand. It was beautiful. She found herself simply watching it happen, while working to assimilate that she was putting clothes on and off with her mind. Wishing for them to be gone wasn't enough, she realized. She had to visualize it, apply her will for the change to happen. The tattered rags kept coming back without a hitch, on and off, on and off. Well then, this crap outfit better not be all there is to it. This time she visualized the clothes she'd been wearing when she arrived. Her white top and beloved purple sweatpants materialized with a fascinating flourish, snug around her skin as if they had never gone away. Whoop! Alexandra covered her mouth with her hands and looked around, wary of passers-by. Then she forgot about keeping watch altogether because her thoughts swam in a pool of wonderful possibilities. Could she truly don any clothes she wanted merely by willing them into being? The very idea was enough to make her giddy, which in turn filled her with shame at such frivolous thoughts, especially when she was neck-deep in a heaping mound of problems. The shame didn't last long. She went through everything she could remember in her wardrobe, delighted every time a piece of clothing materialized. Then she ventured into items she had never worn herself, trying on clothes that belonged to friends, stores or celebrities. She even gave a few fancy gowns and dresses a go, although, as suspected, they turned out not to be her thing. Some of the pieces fell apart immediately, probably because she lacked the proper knowledge of seams, clasps, and straps. Certain fabrics looked off upon closer inspection, as if the patterns that weaved the materials together weren't fully realized. Still, not too shabby for someone that didn't know the first thing about making clothes. Who would have thought eternal damnation could be so stylish? Alexandra, Gretchen, you are wasting way too much time with this. She stubbornly disagreed with the nagging voice. All frivolity aside, this was a discovery worth exploring. She could alter certain things with her mind. She could control something, however small. It was a soothing thought. When the demons come back for you, will you soothe them with a fashion show? Alexandra sighed. The nagging voice had a point. Something nasty would catch her if she didn't keep moving. She settled on comfortable clothes fit for running. First of all, appropriate underwear, a sturdy sports bra and suitable panties. Then a long-sleeved shirt with a hood, along with yoga pants. The hood was wide and deep, while the shirt itself clung to her frame, the hem reaching down just barely above her hips. She made the sleeves long enough to hug her hands, and the pant legs long enough to graze her heels. She slashed the white cuffs down the ankle seam for a bit of a fluttery feel. Nothing wrong with remaining a little stylish. She figured it would be best to blend in with the background and color her shirt in a vertical pattern of sinuous shapes, all shades of clear blue that complemented the carvings in the pillars. Her pants were a subdued gradient that went from sapphire at the waist to azure at the ankles. She couldn't resist adding a deep vowed cloth belt at the hip, knotted on one side so that the soft fabric would hang lightly down her thigh. She eyed her feet pensively. 30 minutes ago she would have murdered for a pair of trekking boots, worn sneakers, or even flip-flops. Now she found herself reluctant to put on anything. She may have stolen that tattered skirt and salvaged that pink shirt from a heap of garbage, but it had taken years to earn those feet. Unlike everything else, they felt like a badge of honor. Why, where's the hurry? Try your hands at boots now. Let's see how many hours you can spend making the perfect pair of sneakers. Go nuts and try on some heels just for fun. Why don't you? Jeepers! No longer able to ignore her cautious side, Alexandra figured she could work things out on the move. She had no need for shoes anyway. Alex stood motionless among the rows of pillars, well out of sight. She was staring at the pretty ring that had appeared on the palm of her hand. Every detail was there, from the delicate patterns of vines wrapped around tiny amethysts to the engraving on the inside in the shape of an elongated infinity symbol. She'd always appreciated how discreet and unobtrusive it was, without any points to get caught on fabric or large gemstones that could come off their setting. She could feel the tiny weight of it, the smooth texture of the shank on her skin. She hesitated, then reached to pick it up with her other hand, afraid that it might disappear at the slightest disturbance. The mere consideration of the possibility introduced a small flicker to its substance, a slight attenuation of its solidity. The ring is there, she admonished herself. It won't disappear no matter what I do, and that's that. It felt real enough between her thumb and forefinger. It still did when she slipped it around her free ring finger. A little too real, she thought irritably as she struggled to get it past her bony joint. She stared at it some more, fascinated with her accomplishment. It had started as a simple thought. There's nothing special about fabric, it had occurred to her. What else can I make? Curiosity had taken over, and after some consideration she set out to replicate the only earthly possession still on her person. What could be simpler, she reasoned, than making a copy of a ring she knew in every detail? Her first efforts had yielded nothing. Her further, more involved, more doggedly stubborn efforts had yielded faint eddies of mist gravitating towards the center of her palm, shimmering brighter as they formed a dense band of smoke atop the lines of her hand. She'd nearly fallen on her ass from surprise at the sight, which made all her progress vanish in an instant. forging her will into an indisputable certainty, had produced a flow of swirling ethereal shapes that collapsed into one another, forming a ring of white mist that solidified and hardened in the space of seconds. The details that she held so clear in her mind sprung from thought into reality and coalesced upon the ring as if they had always been a part of it. At first, she could hardly believe it. Now, she could hardly stop there. What else could she do? She looked around for the 100th time, making sure there was nothing new in sight. Her surroundings proved to be as deserted as ever. With hardly suppressed excitement, Alexandra put her mind to work. Some 15 minutes later, an assortment of disparate objects cluttered around her feet. She surveyed them with a furrowed brow. A brown wooden stick, 1 foot long, smooth and featureless. A simple wooden mallet. A claw hammer with a crude metal head. A large sledgehammer, almost too heavy to lift comfortably. The blade of a curved sword, somewhat dull. An unadorned sword hilt without a slot for the non-existent tang of the blade. A razor-sharp saber with an ornate hilt and a wide, sinuous guard. A thick bristled hairbrush. A hand mirror that reflected nothing. A magnifying glass that did not magnify in the slightest. A hunk of metal in the rough shape of a handgun. A hunk of metal that looked very much like a handgun, but not quite right. An honest-to-goodness 9mm semi-automatic that did not work, surrounded by what very much looked like bullets, but weren't. A 2-inch-long wooden stick with a slightly bulbous head painted red. Next to it, an empty matchbox. Next to it, a number of matches, most of them broken or beaten, but none used. The scattered parts of a lighter, an unidentifiable liquid leaking from the top of the reservoir. What she imagined a flamethrower should look like, complete with a heavy propane tank, a harness, and a long hose with a handle and a trigger. It didn't do a damn thing. The semblance of a short bow, strung too tight, discarded unceremoniously. An extremely primitive bicycle leaning against one of the columns. It had no brakes, no chain, deflated tires, uneven spokes, and rigid pedals. Entirely useless. A car tire. Alexandra had reached a few conclusions through the process. The first was that she knew precious little about how machines actually worked. She'd fired handguns thousands of times in online matches, but she had no idea how the bullets were loaded into the chamber from the magazine or how the trigger mechanism made the gun go pow. She couldn't even figure out the simplest standard flamethrower, much to her disappointment. Second, it was possible to alter things without having to make new ones, and it would require significantly less concentration. The sword turned out to be a fine piece of craftsmanship when she was done with it. Too bad she'd never learned to wield one effectively. Also, volume and weight mattered a great deal. A large stone wall that would have barred the hallway from end to end had refused to show up, no matter how much effort she put into it. A thick slab of granite the size of a mattress had lasted maybe a whole 30 seconds before it dissolved into shimmering fumes. The chassis of the first car she'd ever owned got as far as being outlined in faint smoke before disappearing, and with it her hopes of driving all the way to this Nexus place. She made the tire mostly out of spite after that. Just as her thoughts were touching the accursed tire, she saw the sad excuse of a bike frame ripple, become translucent, and break down in misty swirls. The tire followed almost immediately. Well, guess I'm stuck walking. Things that she didn't care about vanished without warning. She stepped toward her latest and most prized creation as items kept dissolving all around her. A beautiful staff leaned against one of the columns. Alexandra lifted it off the ground and held it in both hands, enjoying the solid feel of the carved hardwood in her palms. It was slightly longer than she was tall, with notched steel caps tipping both ends. Tightly wound leather straps braided a fifth of the staff's length at either side and center to aid grip. The naked wood, varnished dark brown, displayed myriad curved lines of intricate carvings that glowed a faint turquoise, in keeping with the oh-so-lovely blue theme of her environment. Creating that elegant vine-like pattern just by thinking of it had been one of the most wonderful things Alexandra had ever done. There were a number of excellent reasons to justify crafting this weapon. Fighting would be much easier. She couldn't get guns to work or use a bow with any semblance of proficiency. She wasn't able to throw a knife to save her life or even begin to figure out how to shoot a slingshot. but she had learned how to handle a staff at the gym. A long stick was her best available option. It was a fashionable stick because the limits of her crafting skills were worth testing. She had feared that getting the glowing effect in the carvings would be problematic, but colors came easy as pie. The hardest part had been getting the leatherwork right so it wouldn't fall apart and dissipate. And there were many miles yet to cover, if she could trust the monster she had questioned. A walking stick couldn't hurt. All perfectly reasonable. Her efforts had nothing to do with the fanciful idea of walking around with a kick-ass staff, looking cool and mysterious. She had absolutely not been tempted to add a cloak to her outfit, and Erin's fantasy novels and their staff-wielding wizards had had nothing to do with her weapon of choice. Her decision had been purely functional. Alexandra rested the staff in the nook of her shoulder, using both hands to very deliberately put up her hood and resume her long trek toward the exit. The steady beat of steel on gravel set the pace of her footsteps.